Have you ever realized someone loved you only after the whole world was listening? That question echoed through Ethan Brooks' mind the second he heard his own name spoken from a stage he had never planned to remember. Friday nights at the Lantern were usually predictable. The little music venue tucked between a bookstore and an old coffee shop in downtown Portland attracted locals who cared more about lyrics than fame. Ethan had only stopped by because his co-worker canceled at the last minute, leaving an extra ticket that would have gone to waste. He almost stayed home with takeout and an unfinished illustration waiting on his tablet. Looking back, he wondered how different his life would have been if he had. The room glowed beneath warm amber lights, soft conversations blending with the gentle tuning of guitars. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with polished wood, creating the kind of comfort that made strangers lower their voices without realizing it. Ethan slipped into a seat near the back, happy to disappear into the crowd. He preferred observing people instead of being noticed. It had always been easier that way. When the lights dimmed, applause rolled across the room like distant thunder. Noah Carter stepped onto the stage carrying nothing except an acoustic guitar and a quiet smile that somehow reached every corner of the venue. Ethan recognized him instantly, even though 5 years had passed since they had last spoken. The same dark hair, slightly longer now. The same calm blue eyes that always looked as though they were searching for something beyond the obvious. Time had changed the details, but not the feeling. Ethan's heartbeat stumbled so unexpectedly that he laughed under his breath, convinced it was only surprise. Noah adjusted the microphone, thanked everyone for coming, and smiled politely at the audience. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent years learning exactly how silence could become part of a performance. Then his expression softened. "Tonight," he said, "I want to sing a song I've never been able to finish until now. It was written for one person. I never thought he'd actually be here." The audience responded with warm laughter, assuming it was another charming introduction. Ethan smiled too, mostly because everyone else did. There was no reason to think those words had anything to do with him. Plenty of songs were written for someone. Plenty of people carried old memories they never shared. Noah rested his fingers on the strings, but didn't begin immediately. Instead, he scanned the room slowly, almost carefully, as if searching through familiar faces hidden among strangers. Then his eyes stopped. Ethan felt the moment before he understood it. Noah wasn't looking past him. He wasn't looking around him. He was looking directly at him. The noise inside the venue seemed to disappear, replaced by the quiet rush of Ethan's own breathing. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to find someone else sitting behind him, but there was only an empty wall decorated with framed concert posters. When he turned back, Noah was still smiling, not the polished smile reserved for audiences, but one Ethan remembered from years ago, the smile that always appeared after they had spent hours talking about impossible dreams and ordinary Tuesdays. Noah leaned closer to the microphone. "Welcome back, Ethan," he said softly. "I've been hoping you'd hear this someday." And with the first gentle chord ringing through the room, Ethan realized the unforgettable moment everyone else had come to witness might actually belong to him. The first notes drifted through the room with astonishing gentleness, wrapping themselves around every whispered conversation until the audience fell completely silent. Ethan remained frozen in his chair, unable to decide whether he should leave before everyone noticed him or stay because his legs no longer seemed willing to move. Noah had always known how to fill a room without raising his voice. That had never changed. What had changed was everything else. 5 years earlier, they had been inseparable. They met during freshman orientation at an art festival sponsored by their university, where Ethan had been sketching strangers while Noah volunteered to perform between student events. Ethan still remembered looking up from his notebook after hearing someone laugh at one of his terrible jokes. Noah had been standing there with a paper cup of lemonade, smiling as though they had already been friends for years. Some people entered your life with fireworks. Noah had arrived like sunrise, quiet enough to miss if you were not paying attention, impossible to forget once you finally looked. Their friendship settled naturally into everyday routines. They explored bookstores on rainy Saturdays, argued over which diner served the best pancakes, and spent long evenings walking beside the Willamette River while Noah hummed unfinished melodies and Ethan filled pages with quick sketches inspired by passing strangers. Noah used to claim that every drawing Ethan made told a story before anyone spoke a single word. Ethan insisted every song Noah wrote sounded like someone remembering home. Neither of them realized how much truth hid inside those compliments. The guitar continued softly as Noah began to sing. His voice carried the warmth Ethan remembered, smooth and honest without trying too hard. Then came the first lyric, describing a young artist who always carried two pencils because he believed one would inevitably disappear. Ethan instinctively touched the pocket of his jacket. Even now there were still two pencils inside. Hardly anyone knew about that habit. The second verse mentioned cinnamon coffee that always became cold because someone spent too much time watching people instead of drinking it. Ethan almost laughed. Noah had teased him about that countless times. Around him, audience members smiled at the beautiful songwriting, hearing only clever details. Ethan heard memories. Every line unlocked another afternoon they had shared. Every melody carried another conversation he thought had disappeared forever. His chest tightened with equal parts comfort and confusion. Why now? Why after all these years? Why in front of hundreds of strangers instead of one quiet conversation? Ethan remembered the afternoon everything changed. He had arrived outside Noah's apartment carrying tickets for a weekend road trip they had planned for months. Instead of finding Noah waiting with his guitar case, he found a moving truck parked outside, and neighbors loading cardboard boxes into the back. Noah was gone. His phone stopped working that evening. Emails received no reply. Social media accounts vanished within days. There had been no goodbye, no explanation, not even a note scribbled on the back of a receipt. Ethan convinced himself that silence was an answer, even if it was the one he never wanted. So he buried every memory beneath work, deadlines, and carefully practiced indifference. It had almost worked. Almost. Noah reached the chorus and lifted his eyes again. This time there was no uncertainty in his expression. There was only recognition, gratitude, and something Ethan could not quite name. The final words of the chorus floated through the quiet room. I never stopped hoping you would hear this. Ethan felt every carefully built wall inside him begin to crack, because for the first time since Noah disappeared, he realized the story he had spent 5 years believing might never have been the truth at all. Applause swept through the lantern, warm and genuine, but Ethan barely heard it. The sound reached him as though it had traveled through water, distant and blurred beneath the weight of memories he had spent years convincing himself no longer mattered. Noah lowered his guitar for a brief moment, thanking the audience with a grateful smile before explaining that the next verse had taken him 5 years to find the courage to finish. The crowd answered with quiet encouragement, assuming he was speaking about the ordinary struggles of songwriting. Ethan knew better. 5 years. The number landed with impossible precision. Exactly 5 years since Noah had vanished from his life without a single explanation. Ethan folded his hands together, hoping nobody would notice how tightly his fingers trembled. He wanted to stand up, walk out, and breathe the cool Oregon night air until his thoughts settled. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, unable to look anywhere except the stage. Noah strummed another gentle progression, and his voice returned with the kind of honesty that could never be rehearsed. The lyrics described 2 friends sitting on the roof of an old apartment building, counting airplanes instead of stars because the city lights made the sky too bright. Ethan felt his breath catch. They had done exactly that during their senior year. Noah used to guess where each flight was headed, inventing stories about strangers chasing impossible dreams. Ethan had secretly sketched Noah while pretending to draw the skyline. Nobody else in the room could have known those details. Nobody else would understand why Ethan suddenly smiled through eyes that refused to stay dry. The song continued, painting ordinary moments that somehow felt larger than life. A forgotten umbrella shared during spring rain. A paper bag filled with blueberry muffins from the bakery that always opened before sunrise. A conversation about growing older without becoming strangers. Every memory arrived with perfect clarity, untouched by time. Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than the performance itself. Noah had remembered everything. Not the dramatic moments people usually held on to, but the quiet ones. The tiny pieces of life that most people forgot before the week ended. Across the room, audience members leaned closer, completely captivated by the storytelling. Some smiled. Others quietly reached for the hands of people sitting beside them. To them, it was simply a beautiful love song. To Ethan, it felt like someone had opened a journal he never knew existed. Near the front row, An older couple exchanged knowing glances as Noah paused between verses. He looked toward Ethan again, but this time there was no urgency in his expression. There was patience, almost hope. It was the same patient smile Noah used whenever Ethan overthought everything from career decisions to restaurant menus. Ethan remembered how often Noah had laughed and said, "You always act like every choice has to last forever." Maybe that had been true. Maybe it still was. Noah reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and carefully placed a folded piece of paper on the stool beside him. It looked worn from years of being carried from place to place. He rested one hand lightly against it before speaking into the microphone. "Some promises take longer than expected," he said softly. "But they are still promises." The audience applauded again, touched by the sentiment alone. Ethan stared at the folded paper, an unfamiliar feeling growing beside his confusion. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was curiosity. For the first time in 5 years, he no longer wanted to know why Noah had left. He wanted to know why Noah had spent all those years carrying something he had never thrown away. The final chord lingered in the air long after Noah's fingers left the strings. Nobody rushed to speak. The silence itself became part of the performance, delicate and meaningful, as though every person inside the lantern understood that interrupting the moment would somehow diminish it. Then the applause arrived all at once, filling the room with warmth that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floor beneath Ethan's feet. He clapped automatically, his hands moving while his thoughts remained somewhere between the present and 5 years ago. Noah stood, bowed his head with quiet gratitude, and accepted the applause with the same humility Ethan remembered from college. Success had clearly changed his career, but it had not changed the way he looked at people, especially not the way he looked at Ethan. As the applause slowly faded, Noah stepped away from the microphone for a sip of water. The host walked on stage with an easy smile and joked that the audience had probably just witnessed one of the most emotional performances ever given in the little venue. Laughter rippled across the room, breaking some of the tension. Ethan welcomed the brief distraction, grateful for a few ordinary seconds to steady his breathing. He glanced toward the exit. It was only 20 feet away. He could leave before the show ended. He could disappear into the cool night, call a rideshare, and convince himself that this unexpected reunion had simply reopened old memories that would settle by morning. His body refused to cooperate. Something deeper than curiosity anchored him to his chair. Noah returned to the microphone carrying the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing edges softened by years of being handled. The paper was covered with handwritten notes, crossed-out lyrics, and tiny sketches in the margins. Ethan recognized the drawings immediately. They were not Noah's. They were his own. Little doodles he used to leave on notebook pages whenever Noah struggled to finish a melody. A tiny paper airplane, a sleepy cat, a crooked lighthouse. Ethan had drawn them absent-mindedly during late-night songwriting sessions in Noah's apartment. He had completely forgotten they existed. Noah smiled as he looked down at the page. "This has traveled farther than I have," he said quietly. "I almost lost it more than once, but somehow it always found its way back into my guitar case." Ethan's heart skipped. He remembered giving Noah that sheet after one particularly frustrating evening when neither of them believed the song would ever be finished. He had written one sentence across the bottom before handing it over. "Keep going. Somebody will need this song someday." Ethan had not even signed his name. Noah looked up again, his eyes meeting Ethan's with unmistakable certainty. Around them, the audience followed the exchange with growing curiosity. They sensed a story unfolding, even if they did not yet understand its shape. A woman near Ethan whispered to her husband that perhaps the mysterious person from the song had actually come to the concert. Ethan heard the words and almost smiled. If only she knew. Noah rested the paper against the microphone stand and spoke more softly than before. "There are moments when you think someone walked away because they stopped believing in you. Sometimes the truth is that life carried them somewhere they never wanted to go." Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him. They did not sound rehearsed. They sounded lived. Every assumption he had repeated to himself over the past 5 years began to loosen. Maybe Noah had not chosen silence. Maybe silence had chosen both of them. As Noah lifted his guitar once more, he drew a slow breath before saying, "The next part of this story is the hardest one I have ever had to tell." Ethan leaned forward without realizing it. knowing that whatever came next might finally answer the question that had followed him through every lonely year since Noah disappeared. Noah did not begin playing immediately. He stood beneath the soft stage lights with the guitar resting quietly against his shoulder, as though the silence deserved as much respect as the music itself. Every pair of eyes in the room remained fixed on him. Ethan noticed nobody reached for a drink or checked a phone anymore. Somehow the entire audience had become part of a story they never expected to witness. Noah drew a slow breath before speaking again. 5 years ago, he said, I thought I had all the time in the world to explain everything. I was wrong. His words settled over the room with remarkable gentleness. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet regret. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. He had imagined this conversation hundreds of times over the years, usually while lying awake long after midnight. Sometimes Noah apologized. Sometimes he admitted he had stopped caring. Sometimes he never returned at all. None of those imagined versions sounded anything like the man standing only a few yards away. Noah glanced down at the worn sheet of paper and smiled faintly. The day I disappeared, I was on my way to meet the person this song was written for, he continued. Instead, I received a phone call that changed everything. Ethan barely breathed. His mind instinctively returned to that Saturday afternoon when he stood outside Noah's apartment holding 2 tickets for the coast. The moving truck, the empty parking space, the unanswered messages that followed. He remembered convincing himself that no explanation was also an explanation. It had seemed easier than hoping. Noah rested one hand over the folded page. A member of my family became seriously ill without warning. I left that afternoon because I believed I would be gone for only a few days. His eyes lowered for a moment before returning to the audience. Those few days became months, then more than a year. During that time, my phone was stolen while I was traveling between hospitals. My email account was locked after repeated security issues. By the time I managed to recover everything, I discovered I had already lost something much harder to replace. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. Every unanswered message, every voicemail, every birthday that passed in silence. He had believed they were ignored. He had never considered they had simply never arrived. Noah continued, speaking with careful honesty. I searched after I came back. I visited the apartment, the art studio, the coffee shop where we used to argue about terrible movies. Everyone told me he had moved away. Ethan remembered that move. 6 months after Noah disappeared, accepting a new illustration job across town because remaining in the old neighborhood hurt too much. Neither of them had actually chosen to leave the other behind. Life had quietly rearranged the pieces while both were looking somewhere else. A small laugh escaped Noah, warm but touched with sadness. The funny thing about hope is that it survives on the smallest things. One sketch, one lyric, one promise written at the bottom of a page. He lifted the paper just enough for Ethan to recognize the familiar handwriting. Keep going. Somebody will need this song someday. Noah smiled directly at him. I finally realized who needed the song. Ethan felt the room disappear around him once again. The years between them no longer seemed filled with rejection. They were filled with missed chances, broken connections, and 2 people who had never actually stopped looking for each other. As Noah positioned his fingers on the strings once more, Ethan understood that the performance was no longer about remembering the past. It was quietly asking whether the future still had room for both of them. The room remained perfectly still as Noah lifted his guitar again. This time the melody carried a different weight. It no longer sounded like someone searching through memories. It sounded like someone finally finding the courage to open a door that had stayed closed for far too long. Ethan felt every note settle into the quiet space inside him where unanswered questions had lived for years. He no longer remembered the other people sitting around him. The applause, the conversations before the show, even the warm lights above the stage all faded into the background. There was only Noah's voice and the impossible realization that the story Ethan had spent 5 years believing had never truly existed. Noah smiled gently before speaking again. There is one more truth I have never said out loud, he admitted. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I kept waiting for the right moment. Then I learned that life does not always give us perfect timing. Ethan lowered his eyes for a second, suddenly remembering dozens of evenings when he and Noah almost said something important before changing the subject instead. They had always assumed there would be another tomorrow. Another coffee, another walk along the river, Another sunset from the apartment rooftop. Tomorrow had quietly become 5 years. Noah began another verse, softer than the ones before. The lyrics were no longer about shared memories. They were about unfinished conversations, about words left waiting inside ordinary days, about smiling at someone a little longer than necessary because saying goodbye never felt quite right. Ethan recognized every feeling hidden between the lines because he had lived them too. He remembered watching Noah perform at tiny open microphone nights during college, secretly feeling proud whenever strangers applauded. He remembered buying an extra muffin because Noah always claimed he was not hungry before eating half of Ethan's breakfast anyway. He remembered catching himself wondering what it would be like if ordinary friendship somehow became something deeper, then immediately dismissing the thought before it had a chance to grow. He had never said a word. Noah's voice remained steady. I spent years believing that if I found him again, I would know exactly what to say, he confessed with a quiet laugh. Instead, I realized the only honest thing I could do was sing the truth exactly as I wrote it. Ethan felt warmth gather behind his eyes. The strange thing was that he no longer felt hurt. Sadness had slowly been replaced by understanding. The empty spaces inside his memories were finally filling with answers instead of assumptions. Across the room, several audience members smiled through their own emotions, touched by a story they could only partly understand. They were witnessing two lives reconnect, even if they did not know the names behind every memory. Noah rested his hand lightly against the strings, allowing the final note to fade naturally. Then he looked directly at Ethan once more. There was no uncertainty left in his expression, only quiet sincerity. "If you are willing," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent venue, "I would rather finish the rest of this conversation somewhere without microphones." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the audience, followed immediately by warm applause. Ethan laughed too, surprised by how natural it felt. 5 years earlier, he believed the silence between them had been permanent. Now, for the first time since that afternoon outside an empty apartment, the future no longer felt like a closed chapter. It felt like an unfinished song waiting for two voices instead of one. The applause continued long enough that Noah had to laugh and shake his head before setting the guitar carefully on its stand. The host thanked everyone for coming, promised there would be a short intermission, and invited the audience to enjoy coffee and desserts in the lobby. Conversations slowly returned to the room, but they all seemed quieter than before, as though nobody wanted to disturb whatever had just happened on that stage. Ethan remained seated for another moment, staring at the empty microphone. His mind felt strangely calm. The questions that had once demanded immediate answers no longer shouted inside his head. Instead, they waited patiently beside something he had not felt in years. Hope. He finally stood, smoothing the sleeves of his jacket with nervous hands. Half of him wanted to leave before reality complicated the simple beauty of the evening. The other half knew he would regret walking away for the rest of his life. He chose the second half. The hallway leading backstage smelled faintly of fresh paint, coffee beans, and polished wood. Volunteers carried equipment from one room to another, while musicians quietly tuned instruments for the second half of the show. Nobody paid much attention to Ethan until one of the stage assistants smiled warmly and asked, "Are you Ethan?" He blinked in surprise before nodding. "He asked us to bring you back if you were still here," she said. "He has been hoping you would stay." Ethan followed her through a narrow corridor lined with framed photographs of past performances. Every step felt both familiar and completely new. Years earlier, he had waited behind stages like this with Noah before local concerts, helping tune guitars and pretending not to be nervous for him. Some memories never truly disappeared. They only waited for the right hallway, the right song, or the right voice to wake them again. The assistant stopped beside a partially open dressing room door. "He is inside," she said with a gentle smile before quietly walking away. Ethan stood alone in the hallway, suddenly uncertain. He looked at the brass handle, took one slow breath, then another. It amazed him how difficult it could be to cross the final few feet after carrying 5 years of distance. Before he could knock, the door opened from the inside. Noah stood there wearing the same denim jacket, his guitar now resting against a chair in the corner of the room. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Noah smiled first, not the confident smile the audience had seen, But the quiet one Ethan remembered from college mornings when coffee had not fully woken either of them yet. "You stayed," Noah said softly. Ethan answered with an equally small smile. "I almost did not." Noah nodded as though he completely understood. "I know." The simplicity of those two words dissolved the last of the awkwardness. There were no dramatic speeches waiting between them. Only two people finally, standing in the same room again after years spent believing the other had chosen to disappear. Noah glanced toward the worn sheet of paper resting beside his guitar. "There is still something I have never shown you," he said. Ethan followed his gaze and noticed that the back of the page held another layer of handwriting, carefully folded out of sight all evening. Noah picked it up with both hands, hesitated for just a second, then held it toward Ethan. "I wrote this the week I came back," he said quietly. "I never stopped hoping I would find you before I had to stop carrying it." Ethan accepted the page with careful fingers, unaware that the words waiting on the other side were about to change everything he believed about the years they had lost. The paper felt surprisingly light in Ethan's hands, yet it carried more weight than anything he had held in years. The edges had softened with time, and faint creases crossed the page where it had been folded and unfolded countless times. He carefully opened it while Noah waited in complete silence. The handwriting was unmistakably Noah's, neat at first, then gradually messier as the page continued, as though each sentence had become harder to write than the one before it. The first line stopped Ethan's breath. "If I ever find you again, I hope you let me explain before you decide whether I deserve forgiveness." Ethan read slowly, allowing every word to settle instead of rushing toward the end. Noah described returning to Portland after everything had finally stabilized in his family. He wrote about standing outside Ethan's old apartment and discovering someone else living there. He described visiting the coffee shop where they used to spend Sunday mornings, only to learn Ethan had changed jobs months earlier. He even mentioned walking along the river on quiet evenings, wondering if they might accidentally cross paths the way they once had so many times before. "I kept thinking the city was not big enough for two people who wanted to find each other," one sentence read. "I never imagined we could spend years missing by only a few blocks." Ethan smiled sadly. He remembered those same evenings by the river, believing he was the only one still looking backward. Neither of them had known they were tracing the same memories from opposite directions. Noah leaned against the dressing room table, giving Ethan all the time he needed. There was no pressure in his eyes, no expectation that everything broken would suddenly become whole again. He simply waited, the way real trust always does. Ethan reached the final paragraph and quietly read the words a second time. "If this letter never reaches you, maybe the songs will. Music travels farther than people sometimes can. If one day you hear my voice somewhere, unexpected, please know that every lyric carrying your memory was written with gratitude before it was written with hope." Ethan lowered the page and looked at Noah. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. "You really looked for me," Ethan finally whispered. Noah nodded once. "Every chance I had. I thought you forgot me." Noah's expression softened. "I tried to forget how much I missed you because it hurt less than believing I had lost you forever. It never worked." Ethan let out a quiet laugh that carried years of relief with it. "We wasted so much time." Noah smiled gently. "Maybe, but we still have tonight." A light knock interrupted the moment before either of them could say anything else. The stage manager opened the door just enough to peek inside with an apologetic smile. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "Everyone is asking if the surprise guest is coming back out for the finale." Ethan instinctively looked behind him. "Me?" She laughed warmly. "Considering the audience thinks the story is about you, I would say yes." Ethan stared in disbelief while Noah chuckled under his breath. "There is one last song," Noah said quietly. "I wrote the ending years ago, but I never wanted to sing it alone." Ethan glanced toward the open doorway leading back to the softly lit stage. Only minutes earlier he had been hiding in the last row, hoping nobody would notice him. Now an entire room was waiting without even realizing it for him to decide whether the story would end with silence or with one more unforgettable memory. The audience welcomed Ethan with encouraging applause the moment he stepped onto the stage. He instinctively looked toward the floor, embarrassed by the unexpected attention, but Noah simply stood beside him with the same calm expression that had always made difficult moments feel a little easier. "Do not worry," Noah whispered quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. Nobody expects perfection. They are just happy to see the ending. Ethan smiled, surprised by how familiar those words felt. Years earlier, Noah had said almost the exact same thing before Ethan displayed his first collection of illustrations at a local art show. Some memories did not fade. They patiently waited for the chance to become part of the future instead of remaining trapped in the past. Noah adjusted the microphone, then turned toward the audience. "Thank you for letting me tell this story tonight," he said. "Sometimes life gives us second chances in places we never expect. I hope all of you leave here remembering that if someone matters to you, tell them while you still can." The room answered with warm applause once again. Noah looked toward Ethan and gently held out the guitar pick he had been using all evening. "Would you keep the rhythm with me?" he asked. Ethan laughed softly. "You remember I cannot play." "I remember you always believed you could not," Noah replied. "There is a difference." The audience chuckled kindly as Noah placed the pick into Ethan's hand anyway. The first gentle chords filled the room once more. This song felt lighter than the others, carrying quiet gratitude instead of longing. It spoke about ordinary mornings, unexpected reunions, and the strange kindness of time. It reminded everyone listening that love was not always measured by grand gestures. Sometimes it survived inside handwritten notes, unfinished conversations, shared breakfasts, and promises quietly kept through impossible years. Halfway through the final chorus, Noah stepped slightly away from the microphone and nodded toward Ethan. At first, Ethan shook his head, but the audience smiled with such patient encouragement that he finally leaned forward. His voice was softer than Noah's, almost uncertain, yet completely sincere. "Keep going," he said, repeating the same words he had once written at the bottom of that old page. Noah smiled with unmistakable warmth before singing the final chorus with renewed confidence. This time, Ethan remained beside him from the first note until the last. When the final chord faded, the audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Ethan looked around the room in disbelief before glancing back at Noah. Neither of them needed another explanation. Some answers could never be spoken more clearly than they had already been. 1 year later, a framed sheet of worn paper hung inside Noah's recording studio beside a new illustration signed by Ethan. Noah's latest album included a song inspired by the night their paths crossed again, while Ethan quietly illustrated the cover that accompanied it. They still visited the same bookstore, still argued over pancakes on Sunday mornings, and still walked beside the river whenever life became too loud. The difference was beautifully simple. Neither of them ever assumed there would always be another tomorrow. Before leaving that little venue on the night everything changed, Ethan glanced back at the empty stage one last time. It looked ordinary again. The lights were dimmed. The microphones had been packed away. Yet he understood that sometimes the places that appeared most ordinary became the ones that quietly transformed an entire life. And whenever someone later asked him when everything truly began, he never mentioned the applause, the audience, or even the music. He simply smiled and answered, "It began the moment we finally stopped believing the silence between us was the end of our story."